When my parents told me I was going to be sent to take care of my great-grandfather, I was very hesitant. My great-grandfather, Iman Franger, celebrated his 110th birthday in December. Not that anyone had been invited to his party. Actually, there had been no party, because my great-grandfather was a shut-in. He was a famous horror writer, writing and publishing stories since the turn of the century, and he was supposed to have a small fortune saved up. As such, he lived in a Mary Shelley-style house out in the middle of nowhere, toiling away at his latest work of terror. My mother had 5 sisters, and all of them had been trying to get the highly coveted spot in Great-Grandpa's will. But so far, none of my cousins had managed it. It wasn't like I wanted any of his money, but Mom was insistent. She had been after Great-Granddad's money, just like her sisters, since her early adulthood, and now it seemed that her time had finally come around. Since all my other cousins had struck out, this seemed to be her chance. She told me to go and spend the summer, and maybe some of the fall with him, and see how things worked out. Bring some of your writings with you. Maybe that'll get you in good with the old man. And that was how I came to be on my great-grandfather's porch in mid-May, preparing to stay until nearly Halloween. The house was an old 3-story that I knew was nearly a mansion from the few times I'd been there as a kid. There were 8 rooms, 5 bathrooms, a kitchen, a study, and of course my great-grandfather's office on the 3rd floor. Sometimes you could see him through the large bay window as he sat up there, hard at work at the old typewriter he favored. He had once sat close to the window so that he could look out and perhaps be inspired by the forests or the lawns that surrounded his property. Now, it appeared, he preferred a spot away from such distractions. I rang the doorbell and was unsurprised to hear the lock click open electronically. Great-Grandpa kept no staff. Before I'd been born, a few of his caretakers had turned up missing, and after several searches of the home and property, Great-Grandpa had finally just dismissed his staff and lived alone. He had mostly relied on the kindness of his relatives, or just done without for most of my life. He was very reclusive, and I wasn't really looking forward to spending the next 6 months in his company. I'd been preparing a manuscript to send off for publication, and I figured that I would have little time for revisions if I was too busy tending to my aging grandsire and his monstrous house. Looking back on it now, I see that I really had no idea what was in store for me. The house had a musty look to it, like some old Gothic construction from one of Great-Grandfather's novels. I don't know if this was intentional, but it gave the place a very uncared-for look. I had to wonder what my cousin Leslie had actually done here when he stayed for 8 months last year. The floors were dusty, the drapes in the kitchen were growing a fine crop of mold from a leaky window, and the whole place just had a very dank smell about it. Given the house's age, this was no surprise. The house was well over 100 years old, and had been both my great-grandfather and my grandfather's ancestral home. Now, it was little more than a hulking relic that sat waiting for my great-grandfather to die so some construction company could turn it into a strip mall. A speaker crackled in the foyer, and the buzzing sound made me jump a foot. "Don't just stand around counting the silver. Come up to my study. I have orders for you." Even at 110, it sounded as though he hadn't lost the steel in his voice. So I climbed up the 3 flights of stairs, wondering how my great-grandfather made it up and down these stairs every day. He must come down to eat, I reflected. He hadn't had anyone to help him since Leslie had left 6 months ago. As my young, sturdy legs made the climb up the creaky old boards, I reflected that I was nearly winded as I came to the 2nd floor landing. I would soon become quite intimate with those steps in the months to come, though. My grandfather sat in the topmost room, a room that had once been the attic. The 2nd set of stairs had been built just for him, and they were steeper than the original set by far. As I came up the stairs, I could see my grandfather's desk and the battered old wing-back chair he had owned since I was a child. The desk and the chair sat in profile, and it was like a scene from a movie. The camera would start a slow pan in and mount the stairs, and the audience would see the back of the red upholstered chair and hear the clicking of the keys. He sat hunkered there like a gargoyle, arthritic fingers tapping away at the keys of his old battered typewriter. The sound was skeletal somehow, like bones against ivory. He kept right on clocking away as I stood a respectful distance behind his chair, not wanting to get off on the wrong foot with this ancient writer that I must share quarters with for the next few months. The attic room was the size of a normal studio apartment and appeared almost Spartan in its furnishings. There was a bed, small and neat, several sagging old bookcases that looked equally as infected with mold, a rug that stretched from the landing to his dark mahogany desk, which sat ever facing into the corner. He had once faced it towards the large picturesque window that looked over his property, but now it looked only into the corner, as though someone had put my ancient grandsire in time out. "I understand that you are to be my new caretaker." I jumped a little, the clicking leading me to believe that he would go right on ignoring me for a little while longer. His voice was creaky, raspy from lack of use. I expected to see dust puff out from behind the chair, and when he turned, I decided that my expectations hadn't been far off. To call my great-grandfather ancient would have missed the mark. The man was shrunken to the point of elvishness. He could not have been more than 4 feet tall, and his arms and legs looked shrunken and childlike. His arms were held out in front of him, hands held down at the wrists in a way that made me wonder how much it must hurt him to ride on. His legs hung an inch above the floor as he sat in that monstrous chair, and I remember thinking that he looked like a child sitting in his father's seat. The image was more grotesque than humorous, however. "You should know that I have high expectations for my helpers. I give no special treatment for family members. Your life here will be hard, but focus on the silver lining. You might just manage to acquire that oh-so-coveted spot in my will that my children and my children's children and now my children's children's children seem so incapable of garnering. Anything is possible, I suppose." And when he shrugged his shoulders, I imagined that I could hear them grind together. Listening to him talk was like watching a particularly talented bit of ventriloquism. His accent was plummy, cultured, and far too deep for the child-sized creature residing in that throne. I expected someone to poke their head out from the back of the chair any minute now, and laugh, saying how they had gotten me. When we both ended up staring at each other for the next few seconds, and no grand revelation was revealed, he went on. He told me about his meal schedule first. He ate breakfast at 5, lunch at 11, and dinner at 6. He subsided almost entirely on Campbell's soup, of which he had a large supply in the pantry. There were 7 different flavors of soup, one for each day of the week, and every month there was a number I would call to have more delivered. He told me that I could make a list of food I wanted as well, and that they would be delivering it to the house with the order. "Just keep the bill under $500 a month," he droned. "I would like to remain in funds until I die." He bathed every night at 7. While he assured me that he didn't need help bathing, he would need help getting to the bathroom, into the tub, out of the tub, and back to his room. I was to put him in the tub and then leave until summoned again. He would be fully dressed again, and when I arrived, I would help him back to his room. His schedule, other than that, seemed to be writing. He wrote sometimes for 18 or 19 hours a day, and would often write well into the night if the mood took him. He rarely slept, he told me, and I would likely find him napping in his chair if I needed something early in the morning. He slept most often between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. I was not to disturb him or make any noise between those hours whatsoever. "When you're my age, you find you just don't need to sleep as much as normal people, but I won't have the little that I do get disturbed by your needless clatter." My duties, other than feeding and bath time, were my own. I would like the house swept once a week, the windows opened once a week to air out the dust, the drapes taken down and washed once a month. I have a sneaking suspicion that feckless cousin of yours didn't accomplish any of these things, so it's likely a mess down there. I do not own a TV, nor do I have internet. There is a phone in the kitchen that you may use if you should need to, and while I do have electricity, I expect you to turn the lights off behind yourself. I seem to recall that your cousin Winifred racked up a $400 power bill while staying here, and I ejected her for it. So long as you follow my rules and keep the house, I suspect I will ignore you for your stay here, and you will have no hardships. He dismissed me after that, and thus began my time in my great-grandfather's house, a time I would come, in later years, to regret undertaking. It first began with the typing. My grandsire hadn't lied. He wrote 18 or 19 hours a day, and the keys of his typewriter were loud. You could hear him typing away from anywhere in the house, and the noise became a constant background drone. Using my hotspot on my phone, I was able to get some writing done, and my proofreading was coming along very well. It was slow, and the signal out here was poor at best, but I plucked away at it as dutiful as I could, despite the distracting sound of all that clacking. The sound almost seemed to scuttle, worming its way into your ears like phantom fingers as you sat trying to concentrate. I tried playing music, I tried using earbuds, but no matter how high the volume, the sound seemed to clatter against my senses like a badly played piano. I began to become rather sympathetic for a certain Poe character, having my own telltale heart clattering at all hours of the night. On sunny days, I would even take my laptop out onto the lawn and get some work done. Though it defied all logic, I imagined that I could hear that typewriter even on the porch or on the way to the mailbox down the lane, easily a half-mile from the house. I know how it sounds, but I also know what I heard, and it invaded not just my waking hours, but my resting hours as well. That's also how the dream started. Sometimes I would dream that it was me sitting in that big old chair, typing away for hours on end as the words just came sliding up the paper. In my dream, the paper was never ending. It simply rolled on and on as it came out of the typewriter. The words rose like a tree in the forest before my very eyes. My fingers would clack endlessly on the keyboard, my young, strong digits becoming withered like great-grandfathers as I typed my life away. I was always in front of that big bay window as I worked, watching the fireflies out in the woods as they frolicked. Sometimes, though, I would catch a glimpse of myself in the mirrored glass and jolt awake as my great-grandfather's face looked back at me. Then, there was the whispering. The whispering had likely been there from the start, but I didn't pick up on it for several weeks. Great-grandpa didn't own a vacuum, so I was stuck sweeping the floors and taking the drapes outside to beat them with a broom. Fortunately for me, carpets were not all the rage at the turn of the century, and Great-grandpa had hardwood floors throughout. I was sweeping the second floor when I heard a spidery whisper coming from the stairs at the end of the hallway. It was nearly unintelligible, the voice the thinnest of whispers, but my great-grandfather was unable to match it in his response. "I won't. You can't make me. You don't even know if he could take my place. It doesn't matter. I won't curse him with the same life I've been cursed with. Stop whispering in my ear and let me finish." Then came the loud crash of keys resumed, and Grandpa ignored whoever had been whispering to him. I thought about it as I swept, unsure what to make of it. Who had he been talking to? More importantly, who had he been talking about? I knew that he had no phone up there. If he needed something, he always called down the stairs, and the whispering had sounded like it was coming from right inside the room as opposed to a phone. I shook it off as the senile ramblings of the old and troubled man and went about my chores, wanting to get them done so I could return to my own work. That was the first time, but it wouldn't be the last time I heard those whispers. I began to hear them in more than just Grandpa's study as well. They began as something like the scrabbling of mouse feet, a skittery noise that scrabbled across my senses sometimes. The longer I listened, the more I heard, and what I heard was frightening. They whispered about far-off places and foreign hellscapes. They whispered about terrible devils and ancient evils, all of which would win in the end, despite the hero's best efforts. I heard them sometimes in my sleep, a place I could not escape them, and they often filled my dreams with terrible prophecy. The work was literally the third indication that something was amiss. While Grandpa's genre had always been horror, I was more interested in fantasy and YA. My current manuscript was a puff piece, something to get my name on the desk of an agent or a publisher so I could work on more groundbreaking fantasy. My story was good, warring vampire clans and a romance that was trying to blossom amidst the chaos, but it was nothing new. It was a safe bit of YA pseudo-fantasy, the kind that had a built-in audience and was fairly safe. The longer I worked on it inside Grandpa's house, though, the darker the story began to become. Characters began to die more often, backstories became less teen-friendly, and a shadow fell across what had been a fairly light little book up until that point. A lot of my time seemed to be spent fixing changes I had made the day before, and I was getting frustrated with the shifts in tone that seemed to be trying to take place in my story. It was as though someone was also whispering in my ear, telling me to spill blood or inject horror where none was needed. I found my mind wanting to write things that I'd never been interested in before, and the feeling made me uneasy. Then, one morning, I woke up to find my great-grandfather reading some of my additions from the other side of the table. I had fallen asleep at the keys, and when I woke up, I saw his spindly arms scrolling down as he read. It was clear he didn't like using the computer. He made a face every time he had to touch the keyboard, as if putting his fingers on it was something unpleasant. And when he saw me noticing him, he turned the computer back towards me. Then, he did something I'd never seen him do in all the years I'd known him. He smiled. "You write well, boy. It's a little fluffy for my taste, but it appears that I'm not your target audience. How long have you been writing it?" I told him I'd been writing my current work for about a year, but I'd been writing in general for most of my life. He nodded, seeming to like the taste of this new information. "Thought I was the only one, at least since your Uncle Stephen passed." Then, he slid out of the chair, his feet barely making a sound as they touched the floor, and ambled back upstairs. After that, I seemed to notice him hovering around the dining room often as I made corrections and changes to my manuscript. At first I tried to ignore him, not wanting to make it awkward, but as the weeks tripped by, I asked if he'd like to come help me with my revisions. He declined at first, saying he needed to get back to work. But over time, he actually came to sit with me and helped me labor through the 500 pages of tween trash, as he often called it. Every new revision, the darker ones at least, seemed to interest him, and I found myself taking his suggestions more than I rejected them. Then, one day around Halloween, he invited me to his study. He said there was something he needed to show me. He was standing by the gigantic wingback chair when I arrived. He looked even more like an underfed child as he slid a hand over the arm, his head only slightly taller than the arm of the chair itself. "You've impressed me, son. Your writing is a little rough, but I suppose that all writing looks rough after a century of it. Many people have asked me how I've lived so long, and writing is the secret to my success. The writing, however, is only half of it. The other half is this." He stroked the chair again as he said it, a look between loathing and loving crossing his face. "Your chair?" I asked skeptically. "Not my chair. This chair was never mine. It was loaned to me on the grounds that I use it for its intended purpose." "And what purpose is that?" I asked, feeling the hair on the back of my neck prickle. "Terror," he answered. I almost expected to hear thunder rumble outside as he made this exclamation. "The chair is meant to spread terror?" I said, trying to keep the skepticism out of my voice. Great-grandpa didn't seem to notice. He just kept looking at the chair in that loathsomely fascinating way he had. The chair seemed to have him under its sway, and he was powerless to cleave from it. "The chair is a conduit. Its purpose is simple, to spread fear and to propagate terror. You've heard the whispers by now, I'm sure." I nodded, hearing them scurry across me even now as I watched my grandfather stroke the old chair that suddenly seemed to be shallowly respirating before my eyes. "From the second I read the changes to your manuscript, I knew it had gotten in your head. It calls to you, just as it called to me, and now it wants to make a deal." I took a step back from the chair. "What are you talking about? A deal? What sort of deal?" "You can write forever. Write as much as you want, and your work will make you the kind of money that puts normal men to shame. All you must do is sit in this chair and let it work through you. You can do that, can't you?" I wanted to refuse him, this grinning skeleton in his slowly, but now visibly respirating chair. The longer I looked at it, the more I could see the baleful eyes, the fanning nostrils that were almost snake-like, the grinning mouth that sat in the seat. It looked at me, and as much as I wanted to deny what he was saying as the ramblings of a crazy old man, I couldn't. The chair's glamour had slipped away, and now I could see the monster that lay beneath. "Come sit," he beckoned. "Come sit and let it show you its power." I didn't want to. Sitting on that thing was the last thing I wanted to do, but I found my legs had other ideas. I had moved as if by magic, my legs that of a puppet's on strings. I expressed all my will, but I was a child resisting a hurricane. Great-grandfather moved aside as I came before his throne. and when my bottom slid into that hoary old thing, I expected the teeth to gobble me up. Instead, I was filled with something unexpected. I was filled with completion, a sense of homecoming. I was complete. I saw myself reach for the typewriter, as I had done in my dreams. The whispering beckoned me to write, compelling me to spill my talent for it, and I obliged. The words rolled from me. They weren't mine, not mine at all, but they oozed from my fingers like blood. My words became the click-clacking of the keys. My mind was a chalkboard fit only to be wiped and filled again and again. I was taken over, possessed, and the demon of inspiration capered through me. There was no endless paper now, but I saw the sheets filled and refilled again and again, made full only to be exchanged by another, and as I looked down at the ivory keys, I felt my sanity reassert itself as I saw the stains on that virgin ivory. They were dark, old blood, but they would surely be wetted again. I don't remember passing out, but I remember waking up. I was lying on the bed in my great-grandfather's study. He was sitting on the edge of it, looking even more childlike as his legs dangled. It occurred to me how infrequently I saw him away from his keyboard in all the months I'd been here, and he looked both forlorn and greatly relieved as he watched his withered feet swing. "You did quite well. The first 300 pages of a manuscript that will soon grace the New York Times bestseller list, I'm certain. At least, my agent seems to think so. I never have much of a head for popular fiction." "What?" But I realized I didn't know what to ask. "It kicks like a mule, don't it, son? I remember the first time I experienced it, back in 36, or was it 26? Who can remember? I was edging towards middle age then, kids out of the house and off on their own, and your great-grandmother had just died of a sudden pneumonia. I was alone in this mausoleum, sure that I had maybe one book in me, but unsure of how to coax it out. The man I bought the chair from showed up out of nowhere, showed up as if I had summoned him, and said he had just what I was looking for. Then he showed me this ghastly hulk you see crouching over there, and I was highly skeptical. My eyebrows slid up even more when he said that it had already been paid for." He got a dreamy look on his face, as though his mind was casting back through time. "He told me that all I had to do was write, just write, and the chair would do the rest. He told me that the chair would take my writing into heights that no one had ever dared hope, and all I had to do was shake his hand. When I sat down to begin, the man tipped his hat and grinned like an imp. I never looked back. At first, it was thrilling, churning out stories, books, whole series over the course of years. I was detailing my legacy at a breakneck speed. I was like a dragon, looking up to see decades pass by as I sat before my window." His dreamy look became melancholy then, his toes flapping bonelessly as his legs rose and fell like lunatic jackstraws. "This is my legacy, boy. This is the inheritance that all my children and all my grandchildren and all my great-grandchildren have struggled for. The money, the house, the land, none of it matters. My inheritance is that chair and that typewriter and a legacy of stunning horror. It is a mantle, and if you chose not to take it up, I would understand. But, and I know from experience, if you don't take it up, you'll drive yourself crazy thinking about what could have been. You'll wonder if the success you have couldn't have been greater, if the joy you felt could not have been more, and if your years upon the earth could not have been better spent." He looked at me then with such naked hope that I realized what it would mean if I took this burden from him. He would die, but it seemed he was ready to die. His legacy would be mine. The paper would say that the talent ran in the family, and it would continue to run until I passed it on or fell to dust. In the end, I can't even say that I did what I did to save my great-grandfather from his continued suffering. In the end, I did it because he was right. If I didn't do it, I would always wonder what if. He extended his hand to me. "The papers are signed and sitting on my desk. The house, the land, it's all yours. Everything. And everything that comes with it, he emphasized. I'm proud to say that my hand didn't shake as I took his. On the third pump of his arm, my great-grandfather turned to dust, and I was left to sit and watch him scatter across the place he loved so much. Then I took my place in the mouth of that great beast and began to write. I would continue to do so for a very long time. It's been so long since I watched my grandsire dissolve before my eyes. In that time, I've been the most prolific horror writer of my age. I've built up money like some old dragon, sitting on my wealth as I hunker on my hill. Sometimes my relatives come to see me, but most times they don't. My own mother refused to talk to me after great-grandfather left everything to me in his will, but I hardly noticed. She died a few years ago, or was it a few decades? I didn't attend the funeral. Being away from my work for too long makes the whispers less quiet. I travel some, as my grandfather must have done in the beginning, but I never stay away for long. The stories must be told, the conduit must be maintained, and I must remain the keeper of this black lighthouse. It takes a toll, though, to be certain. I understand why my great-grandfather slept so little. If I cannot continue to expel this darkness, it pools inside me, and the vivid nightmares often bring me screaming back to reality. The bags under my eyes have become luggage, and yesterday I glanced up into the window and thought I'd seen a ghost. The old man that looked out from it was withered and sunken, and I thought that great-grandpa's ghost had returned to torment me. I see now why great-grandfather moved into the corner after a time. I'm not entirely alone, though. My cousins have gone on to have children of their own, and sometimes they send them to me, as I was once sent. One of them, a girl named Katie, is on her way now. I've heard that Katie is a rather prolific poet, and said to be quite talented. We shall see what the chair makes of her. Who knows? Perhaps I might be allowed to stop too before long, and bask in the comfortable blackness that awaits me as well. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. If you enjoyed tonight's story, go ahead and hit that subscribe button for me. Maybe turn on notifications so you don't miss any other stories. We're getting close to 1,000 subs, and I know the algorithm likes it when you've got over 1,000 subs. Regardless of whether we have 1 sub or 100,000, I'll be here 3 times a week to read the stories you love just for you. Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our sponsors before we sign off. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle and Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributors. Thanks, guys. We just couldn't do it without you. And of course, a big thank you to Glenn Jenkins for being our Ghostwriter tier contributor. Hope you're doing well, Glenn. Hope those books are treating you alright. If you too would like to support the show, come on down to Patreon. For the price of a arguably overpriced coffee drink, you too can support the show and have your name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video that I make. If you'd like a copy of my books, they're up on Amazon. I have 4, with a 5th coming out in July. There's a link in the description, so come on down and purchase one of my books. I always recommend Dark Vortex because that's what we're reading on our Wednesday story now, so you can read along with us. It'll be like a little book club. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.